They mocked my dead mother in front of 60 guests, and my fiancée laughed along. I stood there holding a half-empty glass of Cabernet while Marlene Hart raised her voice just loud enough for the laughter to echo through the chandelier-lit dining room. Helen always had opinions, didn't she? She said, nudging her husband with a grin. God rest her soul, but she did love meddling. Clark chuckled beside her. She meant well. Too much sometimes. I guess Everett gets it honest. I felt the blood rush to my ears, the room blurring for a split second as I looked to Vivian, praying for some flicker of discomfort. But she smiled. Not the nervous kind, the kind that says I agree. That was the moment, the sound of forks scraping plates, the low hum of fake laughs, the scent of oversalted duck breast and fake sincerity hung thick in the air. I placed my glass down quietly, stepped away from the table, and cleared my throat. You know what? Let's not wait for the wedding. 60 heads turned. I could feel the tension knotting behind my ribs, but I didn't care. This was no longer a celebration, it was a reckoning. Have you ever stood in a room full of people and realized not one of them truly respected what matters to you most? Let me know in the comments, because that night I learned silence speaks loudest when someone finally breaks it. People think grief fades. That time dulls the sharp edges. But there are days I still open the cedar box that sits on the top shelf of my closet and just stare at what's inside. A silk scarf, her church earrings, the locket she wore every Sunday, etched with ivy leaves as clasp, slightly bent from years of use. There's a faint scent of lavender still caught in the fibers, faint but undeniable. My mother, Helen Quinn, wasn't loud. She wasn't the type to demand attention. But when she walked into a room, things shifted. Not because of power, but because of presence. Because you knew instantly that she would help if she could, and she always could. She raised me on her own after my father left. No lawsuits, no bitterness, just one suitcase gone, and a woman who tightened her apron and went back to work. She cleaned houses during the day and typed medical notes at night. I'd fall asleep to the sound of her fingers hitting the keyboard from the kitchen. The smell of black coffee was her perfume. When I was 15, she paid for my first guitar lessons with tip money. She collected in a jar labeled "Someday." She never missed a recital. Never once. But what most people don't know is what she did for the Harts. Their family restaurant, the Ashbridge Grill, was circling the drain. No credit, no investors. One late night at the diner where she refilled coffee for tips. Marlene broke down, Helen listened. That same week, she co-signed the loan that saved them. She didn't even tell me until years later, said it wasn't something worth repeating, just something worth doing. When the restaurant's industrial oven broke, she bought them a new one. When Vivian's older brother Daniel couldn't afford his last semester, she cut into her own savings to cover it. Said education was worth more than a new roof, and still no one thanked her. Not properly. I remember watching Marlene talk about charity at a church auction going on, about generosity and giving from the heart. My mother stood in the back, arms folded, listening without saying a word. That was her quiet, steady kind, never asking for credit, always there. When she got sick, she hid it for months, said it was just fatigue. Stress. I caught her one morning folding towels slower than usual, her hands trembling. Turned out it was cancer. Stage 3, she fought. For 3 long years. And through it all, she kept showing up for others. For me, even when she could barely hold a mug, she'd say, "You good baby," like I was the one who needed looking after. She passed 2 summers ago, just after the 4th of July. I held her hand in a sterile room that smelled like antiseptic and fading memory. Her last words to me were simple. Be kind, but never let them teach you to shrink. Vivian came to the funeral, stood beside me. Wore black, nodded at the right times. But when I tried to talk about my mother in the months that followed, she grew distant. "She's gone," Everett Vivian once said, placing a hand on my shoulder. "Maybe it's time to start focusing on us." I bit my tongue, told myself it was grief talking, that we all mourn differently. But something cracked inside me that day. Because how do you explain to someone that your entire moral compass, the one thing that kept you upright, isn't just gone? She's in every step I take, every boundary I hold, every silence I refuse to accept. That's what made that rehearsal dinner so unforgivable. They didn't just mock a dead woman. They mocked my foundation. And Vivian, she let them. She smiled through it. She called it a joke, so I stood up and now I'm telling this story. Because if you've ever been taught to stay quiet to keep the peace, maybe it's time we both stopped shrinking. The thing about disrespect is it doesn't always come with a bang. Sometimes it's a whisper, a glance, a joke no one laughs at, but everyone hears. It started small. I told myself that for months. The first time I noticed it, we were planning the ceremony I mentioned, including a short tribute to my mother, a photo by the guest book, maybe her favorite hymn played quietly before the vows. Vivian's smile faded for just a second. "Isn't that going to make people sad?" she asked, flipping through floral arrangements on her iPad. "I mean, weddings are supposed to be joyful." I blinked. "It's not a funeral song. It's her favorite hymn. It reminds me of her." "Of us," she nodded absently. "We'll think about it." She never brought it up again. At first I blamed it on nerves, wedding stress pressure from her parents. But the pattern grew clearer each time we saw them. "You know," Clark Hart said one night over dinner, swirling his wine like a man on his third glass, "Vivian always did have a thing for projects." I looked up. "Projects," he grinned. "You know, someone to fix, someone to grow with, someone with potential." Marlene laughed softly. "Well, we all make sacrifices for love, don't we?" Vivian said nothing, just brushed a crumb off her napkin and took another bite. They said things like that often, subtle digs wrapped in napkins and red wine. "You grew up in West Gresham, right?" Marlene asked once in that sing-song voice that makes a question sound like a judgment. "That's near the train yard, isn't it?" Clark added. "Your folks had a small house, right? Just you and your mom." Every time I answered, I watched their eyes. Not curious, calculating. Vivian never corrected them, never stepped in. Sometimes she even laughed. One time I mentioned how my mom had helped them with their restaurant loan. Vivian blinked. Did she like it was news? Like it hadn't come up in all our years together? I pulled up the photo on my phone, the one of Helen standing with Clark and Marlene outside the Ashbridge Grill. Arms around each other just after the remodel. She co-signed the loan. I said paid for the new oven, helped them reorganize their books. "You've seen this photo before?" Vivian stared for a second too long. That was a long time ago, that phrase. It started showing up more and more. That was a long time ago. She wouldn't want you stuck in the past. This is our future now. Once when I brought up putting my mom's name on the ceremony program. She shrugged. Do we really need to make the whole thing about her? And still I stayed. Because when you've loved someone long enough, you start assuming the best, even when they're showing you the worst. You fill in the gaps with what you hope they meant. You translate disrespect into oversight, cruelty into stress. But I wasn't blind. I noticed how Marlene always added an extra chair for photos, even when I was standing right there. How Clark called me pal or kid, but never by my name. How Vivian stopped calling Helen your mom and started saying her. Her casserole was always so interesting, Marlene said once, nose crinkled. "Do you remember how she used to bring that odd potato thing to Easter?" Vivian giggled. "Oh my God, yes." And I just sat there watching them turn warmth into ridicule. Watching the woman who raised me become a punchline. Watching the woman I was about to marry choose silence over defense. Each time I let it slide, something inside me chipped away. And then came the rehearsal dinner. Vivian didn't ask me about the guest list, said her parents were handling it. Didn't ask me about the menu, Marlene's working with the chef. It's a surprise. Didn't ask me if it was okay that only 4 people from my side were invited. We had to fill the table. She said it's not a big deal. It was a big deal. It all was. But by then I'd learned the rules. Don't make waves. Don't ruin the vibe. Smile for the pictures and keep the peace. But something in me was breaking. Looking back, I know the rehearsal dinner wasn't the start of anything. It was the conclusion. The punchline to a joke I'd been pretending wasn't funny for far too long. I wasn't marrying just Vivian. I was marrying into a house that had never once opened its doors to me. And that house was already setting the table for my erasure. The chandeliers above the Marcellus room gave off a golden hue soft enough to make everything look elegant, but not soft enough to blur the ugliness that unfolded that night. I wore a fitted navy suit. Vivian wore silver satin. Clark Hart wore arrogance and a pocket square that matched the wine he kept sipping. And Marlene wore the room. She floated through the dinner like she owned the air itself, touching shoulders, laughing too loud, telling the staff which glasses to refill and which plates to remove. Vivian barely touched her food. I always noticed. She scrolled through her phone as people arrived, barely registering the 3 people from my side who'd shown up. My dad, my younger sister, and my old college roommate. The rest of the room was filled with Hart relatives and business associates, networking in gowns. It was never about us, but I told myself again, just smile. Get through the night, tomorrow would come, and maybe with it, clarity I was wrong. After the entrees were cleared and a round of applause followed some corny toast from Vivian's cousin Clark stood fork against wine glass. Tap, tap, tap. The room quieted. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, arms spread, that smug grin never far from his lips. Thank you for being here to celebrate our daughter's new chapter, a union of 2 families. He gestured toward me with an open palm. Our Lydia, and of course, Everett. There was something about the way he said my name, like it had dirt on it. He began telling stories about Lydia as a child, bright, determined, always knowing what she wanted, and now she's marrying someone who will keep her grounded. A few chuckles rippled through the room. She's always been the star in every room, he added, and while Everett may not be what we first envisioned, he trailed off with a wink. Everyone got the joke. Everyone but me. I stared at him, then at Vivian. She didn't look alarmed. She looked entertained. Then Marlene took the mic. I just want to say she began her voice syrupy. Lydia is the kind of daughter any mother would dream of, patient, loving. Patient, especially. She's taught Everett so much already. More laughter, a few nods, a glass clink. She turned toward me. We're so happy to welcome you into the family, Everett. It'll be refreshing to have someone who doesn't mind getting their hands dirty. I almost choked on my water. I felt my father tense beside me. My sister stared daggers at the head table. I looked at Vivian. She was smiling, still smiling. And then came the final blow. Clark stood again, glass in hand. Before we wrap up, I'd like to take a moment to remember someone who helped shape our Everett here. His mother, Helen. For a second, I let myself hope she was one of a kind. Always had a way of inserting herself into situations, didn't she? Laughter, Marlene added. Oh, she definitely had strong opinions. Remember how she used to just show up and insist on helping, even when we didn't ask? I didn't blink. I didn't breathe. Clark smirked. She helped us a lot sometimes. Too much, if I'm being honest. The room chuckled awkwardly. We'll be sure to keep her spirit alive at the wedding, he said, lifting his glass. Let's just hope Everett doesn't inherit her enthusiasm for taking over. That was it. The room quieted. Just for a beat. Long enough for the weight to drop. I looked at Vivian one last time. She laughed gently, then touched his arm. Dad, stop. That broke it. I stood up slowly, the chair dragged just loud enough to silence the table. Every eye turned, I felt my pulse in my throat, my fingers, my ears. Are you serious right now? I said, my voice low but unshaking. Donna looked startled. Clark raised a brow like I just overreacted to a weather report. I glanced at Vivian. They mocked my mother in front of everyone. And you laughed. She opened her mouth but nothing came out. Clark chuckled again. It was a joke, Everett. Don't be so sensitive, I looked at him. Then at the faces around the table. Some curious, some embarrassed, no one brave. I nodded once, you know what I said. Lifting my glass. Let's not wait for the wedding. I set it down. Gently, deliberately. I'm done. And I walked out of that room through polished hallways and hushed conversations, past the valet stand and into the cold night air. Because grief deserves silence. But what they gave her was a stage. And I'll be damned if I let them turn her memory into entertainment. I didn't remember the walk to the car. All I know is by the time I got to the parking lot, the air had turned sharp. One of those spring nights where the cold bites just enough to remind you you're still alive. The key fob slipped in my hand as I unlocked the door. My fingers shook, not from nerves but from release. From something deeper, like when you let go of a heavy box you've been carrying too long and your arms don't realize they're free yet. Behind me, I heard quick steps on pavement, Vivian's heels. The ones she said made her feel tall enough to match her mother's standards. Everett, she called breathless. I didn't turn. Please, she said, just Wait. I leaned against the car and folded my arms. The metal was cold through my suit. She came around to face me. Her hair was a little messy now, eyes glossy. Foundation creased under her lashes. Can we talk? She asked, voice small. I stared at her. Talk about what you blindsided me, she whispered. You embarrassed my parents in front of everyone. I blinked, I embarrassed them. She flinched. They didn't mean it like that. They said my mother was a meddler who inserted herself into things. They turned her generosity into a punchline. And you laughed. Vivian wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I didn't know they were going to say all that, I swear. But you didn't stop them. She didn't answer. I exhaled long and steady. You know, I kept waiting for you to speak up. For you to look at me across that room and show me you were on my side. But you didn't even flinch. Vivian stepped closer. I was scared. Okay, I didn't want to make a scene. You didn't want to upset your parents, I said flatly. So you let them spit on the only person who ever gave a damn about you outside of your bloodline? That's not fair, isn't it? I asked. She looked like she wanted to argue, but she didn't, because she knew I love you. She said, barely a whisper now, please don't let this ruin everything. I tilted my head. You want to know what ruined everything, Viv? It wasn't tonight. It was every night before this when you let them talk down to me. When you said nothing as they chipped away at the parts of me that came from her. I took a step back, the air colder now between us. You didn't just fail me, I said. You failed her. Her lip trembled. She reached for my hand. I didn't move. I'll talk to them, she said. They'll apologize? It's too late. She stared at me like she didn't understand. Maybe she really didn't. I deserved someone who would have stopped the speech before it started. I said, not someone who clapped when it ended. She began to cry, ugly, desperate tears. But I didn't move. I didn't reach for her. I didn't comfort. Somewhere inside, something had gone still. And once stillness settles like that, it doesn't leave easily. Behind her, I saw my dad standing near his car, arms crossed, watching silently. My sister was beside him, jaw set. He gave me a nod, just once. That was enough. Vivian followed me with her eyes as I opened the driver's side door. You're just going to walk away, she asked. I looked at her one last time. Really looked, I already did, I said. And then I closed the door. The sound of it echoed louder than I expected. She stood there as I pulled out of the lot, her arms wrapped around herself, her dress catching the wind, a silhouette of someone who finally realized she'd mistaken silence for strength and loyalty for weakness. But I wasn't weak anymore. I was done making room for people who didn't make room for her memory. And I wasn't marrying into a family. I was walking away from a legacy that never saw me as enough. And for once, I wasn't apologizing for choosing myself. 3 days later, I opened my mother's keepsake box and knew instantly that something was wrong. The lid felt lighter. The familiar click of the hinge wasn't there. I moved the silk scarf aside, lifted the velvet pouch where her locket had always rested. Empty. My heart stuttered. I checked the floor of the drawer. The corner behind the shelf, I rechecked the box again. Nothing. It wasn't just any locket, it was hers. A delicate oval piece of brushed gold, etched with ivy leaves and age. Inside a photo of her, holding me as a baby in a lock of hair from the day I was born. She wore it every Sunday, every holiday, every time she needed strength. She gave it to me before she passed. One day she whispered, pressing it into my palm, "You'll know who deserves this," and now it was gone. Only one person had been in my apartment in the past week besides my family. Vivian, she came by to drop off the engagement ring the day after the rehearsal dinner. Stood stiff in the doorway, asked to use the bathroom before she left. I didn't think twice. I pulled out my phone and texted her, "Did you take my mother's locket?" 3 dots, then silence. A minute later, "What are you talking about?" I stared at the screen. My thumb hovered, then I typed the locket from her keepsake box. "It's gone. You're the only one who's been here." "Did you take it?" This time it took longer. "I borrowed it." She finally wrote, "I wanted to feel close to you. It felt like, I don't know, like I could still hold on to something." My jaw clenched so tight it hurt. "You borrowed it without asking, without even telling me." No reply. I didn't text again. I grabbed my coat keys and drove straight to the Hart estate. pulled up the long stone driveway like I had so many times before, only this time the air felt heavier. Final Marlene answered the door as surprised to see me. Everett, she began smoothing her cardigan. We weren't expecting. I'm here for the locket, I said, voice like glass. She blinked. Excuse me. Vivian took my mother's locket. I want it back. A pause, then footsteps behind her. Vivian. She came down the stairs slowly, holding the locket in her hand. It dangled from her fingers like it was nothing but cheap costume jewelry. Tears rimmed her eyes, but I didn't care. Here, she said softly, holding it out. I was going to return it. I didn't want to let go of you yet. I snatched it from her hand. My fingers curled around the cold metal. This doesn't belong to you, I said. Her mouth opened, closed. She looked down. I didn't mean to upset you, she whispered. You didn't just upset me, you stole from me. From her, she was part of my life too. No, I said, shaking my head. You lost that right the second you laughed when they mocked her, and now you've taken the only piece of her. I had left, I just wanted to feel close to you again. You don't get to feel close, I snapped. You gave that up, you stood by while they turned her into a joke, and now you think holding on to this will fix that? Vivian's voice broke. I didn't know what to do. I thought you thought wrong. I cut in. Again, the locket felt heavy in my hand now, like it had absorbed everything I couldn't say. All the silence, all the disappointment, all the trust that used to live between us, now fractured beyond recognition. Marlene shifted behind her daughter Everett. She said carefully, let's not turn this into something bigger. I turned to her, cold it already is. And with that, I stepped back, walked out. Vivian called after me, voice cracking. Everett, wait, please. I didn't stop. Didn't turn. Didn't give her another look. The door slammed behind me like a closing chapter. In the car, I sat for a moment staring down at the locket in my palm, the chain coiled delicately between my fingers, still warm from her touch, and yet it felt like ice. I pressed it to my chest and closed my eyes. She gave this to me. I whispered, not for memory, for judgment. I started the engine and drove away. This time there was nothing left to say and no part of me looking back. But I also knew this wasn't over. Not yet. A week later, I stood in my living room holding a framed photo of my mother. She was smiling at the camera, hair pulled back in that simple way she always wore it. Behind her, our old apartment kitchen, the yellowed cabinets, the chipped mug in her hand. She never cared about perfect things, just real ones. I placed the photo back on the shelf next to her scarf and the freshly cleaned locket. I had rewound the chain by hand, one loop at a time, careful not to tangle it. It now rested in a velvet case tucked inside the cedar box where it belonged. It felt right, like it had come home. The apartment was quiet, just the hum of the refrigerator, the whisper of wind through the barely open window. Spring was shifting into early summer. Lighter air, longer days, the kind of days Mom used to say were made for starting over. I'd stopped checking my phone. The texts from Vivian had slowed. The calls from Marlene stopped altogether. I hadn't blocked them. I just let the silence hold, because not every wound deserves a reply. Some things are better left unanswered. My sister dropped by 2 days ago. She brought coffee and a bag of my mom's old church programs she'd found in storage. We sat on the couch flipping through them, laughing at the doodles Mom used to make in the margins during long sermons. She'd be proud of you, my sister said, looking at me over her cup. I didn't answer right away, because I wasn't sure I felt proud. I felt clean, clear. And maybe that's better. Maybe healing isn't about feeling triumphant. Maybe it's about choosing peace over vindication, choosing dignity over theatrics, choosing to walk out when staying means surrendering something sacred. That night at the rehearsal dinner, they mocked the woman who made me. And in the weeks that followed, I realized something I'd forgotten in the noise of love and compromise. I am her son, and that means something. It means I don't stay where I'm not respected. It means I don't let silence swallow truth. It means I walk away not to prove a point, but to protect the part of her still living in me. A few days after reclaiming the locket, I started rearranging my apartment. Not out of impulse, not because I needed a distraction, but because it no longer felt like mine. Not completely. Her absence had left a quiet, hollow echo in the corners. And after everything I was done letting that silence belong to anyone else, I cleared the dining table first. Wiped it down with the same lemon oil she used when I was a kid. The scent brought back Sunday morning's gospel music on the radio, her humming low under her breath while folding napkins with care. Then I moved the keepsake box out of the closet and placed it on the bookshelf front and center. No more tucking her away like something fragile. She didn't raise me to be discreet about loyalty. I took down the bland, abstract painting over the kitchen counter and replaced it with her framed recipe card banana bread. Smudged with time, I could still see the mark where she'd spilled vanilla, never bothering to rewrite it. That was her way, imperfect, honest enough. I dusted off the guitar case in the corner. The one she saved up to buy me when I was 15. Strummed it once, it sounded out of tune but not broken, like me. By the end of the day, the place felt different. Not new, not polished, just real again. Mine hours. I stood by the window and let the late afternoon light spill across the floor. The locket hung from a small hook above the desk, catching the sun like it was made for it. Maybe it was. That night I didn't check my phone. Didn't scroll through texts. Didn't replay their voices in my head. Instead, I opened a notebook and wrote down something my mother told me when I was too young to understand it. You don't have to win anyone who makes you feel like you have to earn their kindness. I underlined it twice because now I knew what it meant. Some inherit wealth, others legacy, but I inherited her name. Her love, her grit, and that was more than enough to rebuild with. And I was finally ready to let the world meet the man she raised. I saw Vivian once more 2 weeks after everything ended, by accident. Outside the corner cafe, where I used to pick up pastries for her Sunday mornings, she was stepping out with a to-go cup, hair pulled back, eyes tucked beneath a pair of oversized sunglasses. She froze when she saw me. I didn't. We didn't speak, just stood there for a second, bound by nothing but a shared silence and 100 undone things. Then I nodded. Not cold, not warm, just final. She gave a slight nod back, lips pressed in something close to regret or maybe recognition, and then she walked away. That was enough. I went home that evening and sat at the kitchen table, the one Mom and I used to eat macaroni and talk about the world, like we had more time. I reached into the keepsake box and pulled out the last thing she gave me. Besides the locket, a hand-stitched cloth napkin with a single line of embroidery. It read, "They don't get to rewrite who you are." I used to think it was about pride, maybe even revenge. But now I see it for what it is. Permission to walk away, to stop explaining, to choose peace, not to prove them wrong, but to prove her right. The world won't always recognize the quiet ones, the ones who give, who love without credit, who stand up only when it truly matters. But I do. I carry her in the choices I make, in the boundaries I draw, in the silence I no longer fear. And maybe the greatest act of love isn't shouting into the chaos. It's stepping out of it with your head high, your memory clear, and your name untouched.